Hi, this is Chris Young, and welcome to Good News on Tap for the 8th Sunday of Ordinary Time. We continue again with more of the Sermon on the Mount. We skipped the section where Jesus warns us about showing off when we give alms and fast, and warns us not to show off our righteous deeds. We'll end up going back to that in time for Lent. But in this section, Jesus is warning us about excesses, about greediness, and the hoarding of wealth. He says you cannot serve both God and mammon. Mammon means wealth personified, as if wealth was a god. Being greedy and hoarding wealth is usually a sign of fearfulness about the future. It's an attitude of, I have to gather up everything I can now and hold on to it tight because I'm fearful that I'll lose everything in the future. That sense of fear is a motivator that can cause us to abandon all reason. It's fear that lets tyrants and dictators rule. Fear is the tool of terrorists. The damage of a terrorist attack is not just the lives or the lost property from the attack. The real goal is to literally wreak terror, to make us afraid, to cause us to abandon our peaceful and trustful nature out of fear of what might happen. Now, justified fears can be a good thing. They protect us and alert us to real dangers. But if we get consumed by those fears, it starts a downward spiral that leads to all sorts of problems. Some have suggested that if we were ever to expand the traditional list of 7 deadly sins, that a good choice for the 8th sin might be fear, because it leads us away from God. When we fear, we lose trust in God. In his first inaugural address, Franklin Roosevelt famously said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." We have to remember the context in which he said this. This was the very depths of the Great Depression. Unemployment was rampant, half the world was at war, dust storms were ravaging the Central Plains and destroying crops. It could have seemed to people like we were living in apocalyptic times. But Roosevelt understood that in the face of all these perils and all of these problems, fear was the biggest challenge. Now again this week I have to draw inspiration from world events. The reformers, protesters, and revolutionaries in the Middle East and North Africa set aside their fears to stand up to the tyranny which had ruled them for decades. It was fear that had kept them from doing something about their situation until now. But eventually they began to realize that they had nothing left to lose. The protesters in Egypt were well-educated people who saw themselves as having no future under the oppression that they were experiencing. They didn't fear what they might lose in their future. They recognized that they had no future unless they made one for themselves. But if we can put our trust in God and understand that we're His children and that He loves us, then we can avoid that downward spiral that comes from fears about the future. We can avoid hatred of one another that is born out of fear of what others might do to us. We can, as the gospel reminds us, look around nature and see that God cares for even the least of His creations. If God cares for the birds of the air and the plants of the earth, how much more must He love us and care for us? Seek first the kingdom, and everything else will be taken care of by God. And that's Good News on Tap for the 8th Sunday of Ordinary Time.